Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Artificial and Facts channel. Today, we will be talking about the graphs from the topic of monetary policy and aggregate demand on the subject of economy. Let's get straight to it. When we learn about monetary policy, we learn it affects interest rates and the available quantity of loanable funds, which in turn affects several components of aggregate demand. To view how monetary policy affects the market, we rely on monetary market graph. Development of the money market requires policies that provide incentives for banks to actively manage the risk of running short of excess reserve money, usually by removing the incentive to activate management. But before we discuss the graph, let's talk about money. M1 money is the narrowest definition of money. This includes cash, traveler's check, and checkable bank deposits. Money in checking accounts count because it's used as a medium of transaction. With this definition in mind, we now understand that money is not just the cash in our wallets. We need to differentiate M1 money from other assets. This is because other assets have low liquidity. What's liquidity? Well, it's the ease in which an asset can be converted into cash without much loss of value. After understanding the definitions, let's move on to the graph. We see on top of the interest rate, and on the bottom, we see quantity of money. Let's start with demand of money, as the red circle shows. There are two reasons why people demand money. First is transaction demand, and second is asset demand. Transaction demand is when someone demands money to purchase something. Asset demand is when someone prefers having M1 money that have high liquidity. If interest rate is high, the quantity demand is low. But when the interest rate is low, the quantity demand is high. Why is this? This curve, like all curves, can shift. The reason why the curve shifts can be boiled down to three. First is the price level, next is the income, and also the technology. Price level shifts the curves because if there's an increase in price level, then people will need more money to buy things. Income shifts the curves because when income decreases, then people would want to buy more things. For technology, credit cards are an example. When you have credit card, you no longer need money and decrease the demand for it. When you see the supply of money line, you see that it is vertical. The reason why it's so is because if it's related in the best interest, money is set and controlled by a government central bank. We must point out this graph does not show recession, inflation, or full employment. Instead, it's used to show the idea of monetary policy where the bank increases or decreases the money supply to affect the interest rate, to speed up or slow down the economy. Monetary policy can be divided into two, expansionary and contractionary. In expansionary monetary policy, the central bank uses its tools to stimulate the economy. This causes supply to increase, interest to decrease, investment to increase, and aggregate demand to increase. In contractionary monetary policy, it's used to fight inflation. When supply decreases, interest rate increases, investment decreases, and aggregate demand increases. The shifter of money supply can be divided into three. Reserve requirement, which is the percentage of the deposit banks must hold in reserve. Discount rate, the rate of interest that the Fed charges banks. And open market operations, the government buying or selling bonds to private or commercial banks. In reserve requirement, when you store money in a bank, they hold a percentage of the money and loan the rest out. The reserve requirement is mandated by law. When reserve requirement decreases, the supply of money increases because they can loan more money. When the reserve requirement increases, the supply of money decreases because they can loan less money. In discount rate, when commercial bank borrows money, they can either borrow it from other banks or from the government. The rate they pay from the government is the discount rate. When the discount rate is low, the money supply is high because it's easier and cheaper to borrow. When the discount rate is high, money supply is low because it's harder and more expensive to borrow. Open market operations is the most important shifter in the money supply because the government does it the most. This is when the government buys or sells bonds to private or commercial banks. Other words for bond is treasury bonds or T-bills. Security is also used sometimes. What happens to the market when open market operations happen? So, in summary, the money market graph is used to show the idea of monetary policy. M1 money is not the same as other assets due to other assets having low liquidity. 3. Demand for money is driven by either transaction or asset demand. 4. The curve can shift for two reasons: cash level, income, and technology. 5. Money supply isn't affected by increased rates. And 6. Money supply can be shifted by three things: reserve requirement, discount rate, and open market operations. If the government increases their spending, what would happen? Now on to the next topic.
Inflation is a quantitative measure of the rate at which the average price level of a basket of selected goods and services in economy increases over some period of time. It is the rise in the general level of prices where a unit of currency effectively buys less than it did in prior periods. Inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising and consequently the purchasing power of the currency is falling. Inflation is classified into three types: demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, and built-in inflation. Most commonly used inflation indexes are the consumer price index and the wholesale price index. Inflation can be viewed positively or negatively depending on the individual viewpoint and rate of change. Those with tangible assets like property or stock commodities may like to see some inflation as the rises the value of their assets. People holding cash may not like inflation as it erodes the value of their cash holdings. Ideally, an optimum level of inflation is required to promote spending to a certain extent instead of saving, thereby nurturing economic growth. Inflation is caused by increase in aggregate demand. The main causes from the demand side are: first, increase in money supply. Inflation is caused by an increase in the money supply of money, which lead to increase in aggregate demand. The higher the growth of rate of nominal money supply, the higher the rate of inflation. Next. Increase in disposable income. When the disposable income of the people increases, it raises their demand for goods and services. Disposable income may increase with the rise in national income or reduction in taxes or reduction in the saving of people. The third is increase in public expenditure. Government activities have been expanding much with the result that government expenditure has also been increasing at phenomenal rate, thereby raising aggregate demand for goods and services. Fourth is increase in consumer spending. The demand for goods and services increases when consumer expenditure increases. Consumer may spend more due to conspicuous or consumption demonstrate effect. They may also spend more when they are given credit facilities to buy on higher purchase or installment basis. Fifth is cheap monetary policy. Cheap monetary policy or the policy of credit expansion also leads to increase the money supply which raises the demand for goods and services in the economy. Six is deficit financing. In order to meet its mounting expenses, the government resort to defense deficit financing by borrowing from the public and even by printing more notes. Seven is expansion of the private sector. The expansion of the private sector also tend to raise the aggregate demand. For huge investment, it increase employment and income. Eight is black money. The existence of black money in all countries due to corruption, tax inflation, and etc. It increases the aggregate demand. Nine is repayment of public debt. Whenever the government repays its past internal debt to the public, it also leads increase in money supply with the public. And the last is increase in export. When the demand for domestically produced goods increases in foreign countries, this raises the earning of industry producing export commodities. And the next is the causes of inflation on the supply side. As we heard before, is on the demand side. First is shortage of factor of production. One important causes affecting the supplies of goods is the shortage of such factors as labors, like raw materials, power supply, capital, and etc. They lead to excess capacity and reduction in industrial production, thereby raising prices. Second is industrial disputes. In countries where trade unions are powerful, they also help in curtailing production. Trade unions result through strike and if they happen to be unreasonable from the employer's viewpoint are prolonged. They force the employers to declare lockouts. Third is natural calamities. Drought or floods is the factor which adversely affects the supply of agricultural products. The latter, in turn, creates shortage of food products and raw materials. Fourth is artificial scarcities. Artificial scarcities are created by hoarders and speculators who indulge in the black market. Fifth is increase in export. When the country products more goods for export than for domestic consumption, this creates shortage of goods in the domestic market. This leads to inflation in the economy. Six is lopsided production. If the stress is on production of comfort, luxury, or basic products to the neglect of essential consumer goods in the country, this creates shortage or consumer goods. Seven is low diminishing return. If industry in the country are using old machines and outmoded methods of production, the law of diminishing return operates. Eight is International factor. In the modern times, inflation is a worldwide phenomenon. When prices rise in major industrial countries, their effect spread to all almost with which have traded relation. The next is demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when the overall demand for goods and services in an economy increases more rapidly than the economy's production capacity. It increases demand-supply gap with the higher demand and lower supply, which result in higher prices. For instance, when the oil-producing nation decided to cut down on oil production, the supply diminishes. It leads to higher demands, which result in price rises and contributes to inflation. They may be more one than source of demand. So the question is, name the source of demand, the demand, and the purpose of demand itself.
There may be more than one source of demand. Consumers want more goods and services for consumption purposes. Businessmen want more inputs for investments. Government demands more goods and services to meet civil and military requirements of the country. Thus, the aggregate demand comprises consumption, investment, and government expenditures. When the value of aggregate demand exceeds the value of aggregate supply at the full employment level, the inflationary gap arises. The larger the gap between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, the more rapid the inflation. Given a constant average propensity to save, rising money incomes at the full employment level would lead to an excess of aggregate demand over aggregate supply and to a consequent inflationary gap. Thus, Keynes uses the notion of the inflationary gap to show an inflationary rise in the prices. In the Keynesian view, so long as there is unemployment, all the changes in income in output, and once there is full employment, all is in prices. SS is the aggregate supply function, which is more elastic till Y0. Y0 is the full employment level of income or output, which the SS becomes perfectly inelastic. D0 is original aggregate demand function. E0 is the price level, and Y0 is the equilibrium income. If there is an increase in money, stock, and credit, increase in consumption, investment, or government expenditure, D0 subtracted shifts to D1. E1 is the new equilibrium, which increased demand and fixed supply. P1 is the increased price level. Consumer will purchase more in anticipation that the price will rise more. It will raise the aggregate expenditure so that D1 shifts to D2 at the new equilibrium E2. Thus, in demand pull inflation and the process of raising price is not only initiated the pull of demand, but is also perpetuated by the pull of demand. Cost push inflation. Cost push inflation occurs when overall prices increase, inflation, due to an increase in cost of wages and raw materials. Higher cost of production can decrease the aggregate supply, the amount of total production in the economy. Since the demand for good hasn't changed, the price increases from production are passed on to consumers, creating cost push inflation. The most common cost of cost push inflation starts with an increase in the cost of production, which may be expected or unexpected. For example, the cost of raw materials or inventory used in production might increase, leading to higher costs. For cost push inflation to take place, demand for the affected product must remain constant during the time the production costs are occurring. To compensate for the increased cost of production, producers raise the price to consumers to maintain profit levels while keeping up pace with expected demand. The main points of cost push inflation are: 1. Cost push inflation occurs when overall prices increase due to an increase in the cost of wages and raw materials. 2. Cost push inflation can occur when higher cost of production decrease the aggregate supply in the economy. 3. Since the demand for goods hasn't changed, the price increases. D. Production is passed on to consumers, creating cost push inflation. In the diagram, D is aggregate demand function, which is negatively sloped. SS is the original supply function, which is more elastic till full employment level exists. E is equilibrium, Y is full employment income, E is price level. If there is an increase in money, wages, and costs, the aggregate supply function shifts to SS here. E1 equals the new equilibrium, P1 is the increased price, Y1 is the decreased income below full employment, and Y subtracted by Y1 is the unemployment gap. The increase in price level makes the trade unions to put pressure further so that the living standard of the workers is kept intact. Hence, the employers have to raise wages of the workers, which will increase the cost of production. As a result, average supply function shifts to S2, E2, will be the new equilibrium as price level rises to P2. This process of rising pieces and increasing unemployment goes on so long as the cost push is present. Explain the impact of inflation on distribution of income and wealth to differentiate groups of people.
Thus, inflation brings a shift in the pattern of distribution of income and wealth in the country, usually making the rich richer and the poor poorer. Thus, during inflation, there is more and more inequality in the distribution of income. Second is effects on production. The rising prices stimulate the production of all goods, both consumption and capital goods, as producers get more and more profit when they try to produce more and more by utilizing all the available resources at their disposal. But after the stage of full employment, the production cannot increase as all the resources are fully employed. Moreover, the producers and the farmer will increase their stock in the expectation of a further rise in prices. As a result, hoarding and concerning of commodities will increase, but such increase will not last long as prices remain stable. Of the third is effect on business activity. As firm as increases as the government is required to stand and more
So, the effect of distribution of income and wealth
lower the growth
is the impact.
rate by slowing down the rate of capital formation and creating uncertainty. But inflation, especially a runaway inflation, is an unstable situation. It makes the business world uneasy and uncertain. Society gets disturbed as there grows discontentment among the salaried people and they demand an increase in their wages and salary. The next is what is retributive effect on inflation. The effect of inflation is to redistribute wealth and income from savers, and those on fixed income to debtors, and those on variable income. The borrower gains and the lender loses as long as the interest rate is not adjusted for the rate inflation. The price effect suggests individual can gain more real income by selecting and purchasing goods and services that are increases in the price at a lower rate than alternative selection. The impact of inflation is felt unevenly by the different groups of individual with the nation economy. Some group of people gain by making big fortune and some other lose. We may know this explain in details effect of inflation on different groups of people. That is first on creditors and debtors, and producer and workers, fixed income and earners, and then investor, and then there is traders, speculators, business people, and black marketers. And then the last is farmer. Farmer also gain because the rise in the prices of agricultural product is usually higher than the increase in the prices of other goods. Thus, inflation bring a shift in the pattern of distribution of income and wealth in the country, usually making the rich richer and the poor poorer. Next is, what is hyperinflation? Hyperinflation is a term to describe rapid, excessive, and out of control general price increases in an economy. While inflation is a measure of the pace of rising prices for goods and services, hyperinflation is rapidly rising inflation, typically measuring more than 50% per month. The main point of understanding of hyperinflation are first, when the prices soar over 50% in 1 month, the economy is experiencing hyperinflation. Second, this is often caused by a government that prints more money than its nation GDP can support. Third is hyperinflation tends to occur during a period of economic turmoil or depression. Fourth is demand pull inflation, can also cause hyperinflation. Soaring prices cause people to hoard, creating a rapid rise in demand chasing too few goods. The hoarding may create shortage, aggravating and rage of inflation. Fifth, countries that have suffered horrendous inflation rates are Germany, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and United States during the Civil War. Venezuela is still trying to cope with hyperinflation in the present day. The next is effects on hyperinflation. Question 6.
Give an example of an event that occurred in the real world. In hyperinflation, there are two winners. First is the beneficiaries. For those who took out loans and find higher prices, they make their debt worthless by comparison until it is virtually wiped out. Second are exporters, because failing value of the local currency make exports cheaper compared to foreign competitors. Additionally, exporters receive hard foreign currency, which increases in value as the local currency falls. On to the next topic.
Now let's move on to the next discussion. So now we are going to talk about the investment demand curve. But before we talk about the investment demand curve, here are explanation about what is investment. Investment is an important 16% of GDP because remember, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX, which is consumer expenditures on durable goods, non-durable goods and services, gross business investment, which we are going to discussing here in detail, government spending and exports. So gross business investment, the I component of GDP, refers to the demand by businesses for physical capital goods and services used to maintain or expand its operations. Think of it as the office and factory space, machinery, computers, and so on that are used to operate a business. It is important to remember that investment demand here does not refer to financial investment. Financial investment demand here is like a form of saving, typically by households that wish to maintain or increase their wealth by deferring consumption till a later time. So these are the businesses firms borrow to spend money on. There are new plants or factories, capital equipment or machinery, technology or hardware and software, new homes, and inventories or goods sold by producers, including unsold goods. So investment is the driving force of all economic activity because investment is the catalyst for the large machine and the economic effects such on investment, right? So for an example, if a business decides it's worth their profitable interest to spend a $5 million upgrading or replacing a machine, they figure there is going to be a significant usage of that machine, which means the company that builds the machine is going to receive more orders, which means employment tied to the usage and distribution of the goods and services associated with that machine will increase. So that's why investment is also a leading economic indicator, because if you look at investment as a percentage of GDP, which means 16%, and you tied it to the business cycle, anytime business investment falters will cause a recession. And the longer investment spending wanes, the longer the recession will last. Next slide. So here, the investment is the decision of a firm to spend money or expenditure on a new machinery or construction. It's simply a decision based upon marginal benefits and marginal costs. The marginal benefit of an investment is the expected real rate of return. The firm anticipates receiving on the expenditure. And the marginal cost of the investment is the real rate of interest or the cost of borrowing. So that's a review of investment and why investment is such an important component of GDP. Although it's only 16% of GDP, it's a driving force behind business cycles. And now on to the question, why is investment is an important component of GDP? Next is the expected rate of return, which is the expected profit. And here there are 3 steps of expected rates of return. Step 1 is the cost or benefit analysis to make investment decisions. And step 2 is to assess an expected rate of return to determine the benefits. And step 3 is to count the cost by the interest cost. How do businesses make investment spending decisions? It is to compare the expected rate of return to interest cost. So, in other words, we are comparing the profit, which is the expected rate of return, and we denote it as R here in the slide, and compare with the cost, which is the real interest rate, and keeping in mind that the real investment rate is the nominal interest rate adjusted for inflation, which is denoted as I. So to make it clear, any proposed investment spending is going to be judged by looking at its expected profit, which is the expected rate of return. And what we are looking here is what are we expecting to earn from some proposed capital equipment purchase, and what is it gonna cost to buy that capital, which will normally measure using the real interest rate. So the company compares that expected rate of return, which means the profit, to the real interest rate or the cost of buying the capital. And if the profits, the expected rate of return is greater, then they should undertake that investment spending. So if the profits, the expected rate of return is greater, they should invest. They should undertake that investment spending. Why? Because that investment spending will yield to them more profit than if they don't undertake that investment spending. And what if the profit and the expected rate of return is less than the real interest rate? In other words, the expected profit, the R, are less than what is going to cost to buy the capital. Well, in that case, you don't want to undertake that investment spending. So if the expected rate of return or the profit is less than real interest rate or the cost, they should not have invest, or you should not invest. Why? Because undertaking that investment or invest when expected rate of return is less than real interest rate or profit is less than cost, would actually decrease your profit, which is not what a business intends or want to do. because some possible investment projects are likely to earn high expected rates of return compared to the real interest rate, and others are expected to earn low rates of return. There's an inverse relationship between investment spending and the real interest rates. Simply put, some investment spending is only going to be profitable when the real interest rate is low. And when the real interest is high, those opportunities are not as likely, and there will be a less investment spending because the real interest is high. The rationale firm invest is in all projects up to the point where the real rate of interest equals the expected real rate of return. So I equals R. Very few investment projects are available at extremely high rates of return, and so those opportunities are taken first. On to the question, does businesses determine the amount of investment they undertake? Now, we can see this more clearly if we go ahead to the investment demand curve. And like any demand curve, the quantity of demanded increases as the price falls. The same is true for investment demand. This vertical axis in the curve in the graph is going to be real interest rate, which the capital I is tend to abbreviate as RIR. And the horizontal axis is going to be investment spending, which is indicated with the capital I. So the real interest rate is the RIR, and the investment spending is the capital I, which is in the horizontal axis. The investment demand curve is a downward sloping line. It is a demand curve after all. This shows us that at high interest rates, we will call this RIR1 here at that relatively high interest rate. Notice that what results is a relatively low level of investment spending, but if we decrease the real interest rate to RIR2, notice that the level of investment spending is going to increase to I2. So when the high interest rates at the RIR1, the result is a relatively low level of investment spending. But if we decrease to RIR2, notice that the level of investment spending is going to increase to I2. Changes in RIR causes changes in I. Factors other than R may shift the entire ID curve. And now, once again, remember that this I is in the C plus I plus G plus NX equals GDP formula, the expenditure approach to calculating GDP. And what this means is when we have higher interest rate investment spending, is going to tend to be lower than it is. So that means the capital I is lower and real GDP is lower. And so the tendency of a high real interest rates to I in the GDP formula is lead to lower level of output, whereas at the same time, lower level of the real interest rate lead to the greater investment spending. And so lower RIR is lead to higher levels of output, so higher GDP. Next is the shift of the investment demand. Now nicely, shift of the investment demand curve, which again, we're still talking about demand, special form of demand. But luckily, it's fairly straightforward because it's largely does the same thing that you expect from market demand. And so here are shifts of investment demand curve. When we talk about the shifts of the investment demand curve, just like in market demand, a leftward shift of the investment curve, which is ID2, if you can see in the curve, is a decrease in investment demand. And a rightward shift of the investment demand curve, which is ID3, here is an increase in investment demand. And when investment demand shifts, different levels of gross private investment occur even while RIR remains constant. So what can cause this shift in is there is 5 non-interest rate determinants of investment demand curve. And so these are the things other than any entry, it can influence the amount demanded in economy. In other words, that can shift the investment demand curve to the right or to the left. So first one is the capital cost. So what are we going to talk about here is the actual acquisition cost and the maintenance cost and the operating cost. So if the cost to have the capital increases and this is gonna decrease, so the investment demand curve, or in other words, shift it to the left. So because it shifts to the left, there's an example. So if it's lower cost, it then shift ID to increase. When it's higher cost, it shift ID to decrease. Now the second interest determinant of demand business is business taxes. So business taxes basically a form of cost. So the same thing, if the business tax increase, this is going to cause the investment demand curve to shift left. And as shown over here, will cause the amount of gross investment in the economy to decline. So example, if there is lower business taxes, then it shifts ID to decrease. And when there is higher business taxes, then it shifts ID to increase. And next is the technology. So generally, when there is a technology change, it's an improvement in profitability. So if this happens, then there is an incentive for firms to go invest in new technology because they will be able to get more out of their input. So they're able to earn more money. So this would cause an increase in investment demanded. So example, if we think about a new robot coming out, and if it helps you to make more money, then odds are is that you will go get that robot and put it into your production line. So if an economy is low and capital, then ID increase, and when economy has much capital, then ID decrease. Next is the capital stock. So think of this as excess supply. So if you have idle capital, meaning it's just sitting and not being used, so this increases for some reason. And typically what that means is that there's no incentive for you to get new capital. So that will shift the investment curve to the left and decrease. So example, if there's a new technology, then it shift ID to decrease. And when there's lack of technological change, it shift ID to increase. Then the last one is probably the most powerful one, is expectation. So again, this is expectations of future profits. So basically, if we believe business is going to pick up, so there is going to be a good future, then odds are. That will cause us to increase our gross investment or increased investment demand curve for an economy. So example, if there is a positive expectations, then the shift ID will increase. And when there is a negative expectations, shift ID is will decrease. So next is the instability of investment. There is durability, irregularity of innovation, variability of profits, and variability of expectations. So in durability, capital has a long lifespan. Therefore, once it is built, there is no immediate need for return investment. And for the irregularity of innovation does not proceed in a smooth linear fashion. Instead, there are bursts of innovation followed by periods of relative stability. And for the variability of profits, profitability is subject to forces of competition cyclical by changes in the economy and human management decisions. And for the variability of expectations, political, social, and natural phenomenon shape our positive and negative expectations for the future of the future. And many economists believe that the investment instability is the chief cause of the business cycle. So on to the question, give the reason why there is a shift in demand in investment demand.
So That is all from us here about the graphs in monetary policy and aggregate demand. We apologize for the technical difficulties and thank you for your attention.